Welcome to this enrichment video on the principles of macroeconomics. Today we're going to focus on the difference between real and nominal GDP and why this distinction is going to be really important. Otherwise you can make big mistakes in your analysis. So here's a plot from the Federal Reserve so that you can go online to the Federal Reserve website, I think for St. Louis, and plot all sorts of data. It's pretty straightforward to use and you'll be asked to do this later in the course. And what I've plotted here is the year-over-year change in GDP from 1960 to 2013. So you can see in most years the gross domestic product grew quite considerably, with the exception of our recent recession. So this is 2008 or 9, where it was really, really bad, and you guys all remember that. But otherwise things were pretty good. They were good in the 90s, as you can see, with growth around 5%. And they look like they were really good in the 70s. Look at this high rates of growth sustained throughout the 70s. And I bring your attention to this because if you ask your parents or grandparents about the 70s, most people will tell you that was a real tough time for the U.S. There's actually multiple periods in the 70s highlighted as recessions. Those gray shaded areas are recessions. And a lot of the time people talk about the 70s like it was a kind of real trying time for the U.S. in the Cold War. So what's going on? Why do we see such high rates of growth in the 70s if it was such a tough time? And as you'll probably have guessed from the title of the video, it's confusion over nominal GDP versus real GDP. As you recall from lecture, we denote nominal GDP by PY to sort of indicate that it's a combination of prices and output. And we get it by just multiplying the price of good 1 times the quantity of good 1 plus the price of good 2 times the quantity of good 2, and so on for all the goods in the economy, using the current year prices. And this is problematic because as you go from year to year, from 1972 to 73 to 74, these prices are changing each year. And as you remember from lecture, in the 70s inflation was really high, so these prices were increasing significantly from year to year. And that's why we're seeing the nominal GDP go up so much from year to year. Our preferred measure of GDP is real GDP, denoted just by Y to indicate that it's just about production. And the formula is the same, but hopefully you'll remember the difference is that when we look at these, when we use these prices, we're going to keep them the same for each year we calculate the GDP. So we use what's called base year prices. We pick 1 year, that's the base year, and we'll use those same prices for each year, for 1972, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And then since prices aren't changing from year to year, we're getting a true measure of how output is changing. So I went ahead and plotted real GDP growth for the same years on this plot, and you can see how now the 70s don't look so great. We have a year of basically zero growth here. We have a prolonged stretch of negative growth. Things really were getting worse for people in this deep recession in the mid-70s, and then we have another couple bad years at the end of the 70s right here. Probably caused the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency. Although there are a few years of pretty good growth, they're mostly just making up for the fact that growth was so bad and negative in the bad years. In contrast, the 90s has a stretch of prolonged high growth, year after year after year, from about, 1991 through 2000. And then you can kind of get a sense that our intuitive sense that the 90s were a good time for the U.S., GDP was growing year after year, is accurate, and the 70s were not so good. There were some good years, but a lot of bad years where things were really tough as well. We can make another adjustment, and this was important, we talked about it in class. We don't really, as individuals thinking about our standard of living, care about total GDP. Because if you have a really big GDP and a whole lot of people, like in a country like India, that doesn't mean each individual person has much, and for that reason, I wanted to plot real GDP per capita growth. This shows how much each individual person is getting extra to consume, and this makes the 70s look even a little bit worse than before. So we can really get the sense of why the 70s are considered a sort of dark time for the U.S. economy, and the 90s, you'll hear over and over throughout the course, were a great time for the American economy. Finally, I just want to thank you for watching this video. I hope you continue with the series.